On a gray October morning in Stirling, Ontario, Fletcher Dowd had both hands inside a rusted exhaust manifold and was thinking about nothing except the seized bolt in the fourth cylinder bank when the shop phone rang. Nobody called the landline anymore. His regular customers texted. Suppliers emailed. The only people who called the landline were insurance adjusters, elderly farmers asking about their trucks, and occasionally the school. He wiped his hands on a rag that had given up being clean somewhere around 2019 and picked up. The woman on the other end introduced herself as an assistant to Nina Forsyth. She said Miss Forsyth had a vehicle requiring immediate attention at her estate outside Kingston. 3 specialists had already examined it. None had been able to identify the problem. Would Mr. Dowd be available? What's the vehicle? Fletcher said. A 1972 Ferrari 246 Dino. He set the rag down. I'll be there by 8 tomorrow morning, he said. He drove the highway east through the kind of October morning that convinced you briefly everything was going to be all right. The maples burning orange along the 401, the sky pale and clean above them, the radio doing something quiet he wasn't paying attention to. His truck, a 2007 F-150 he'd bought used and maintained with the same care he gave paying customers, covered the 90 minutes to Kingston without complaint. The estate was north of the city, past the limestone farmhouses, and the concession roads that ran straight as sentences through the fields. The GPS had wanted to take him a different way. He didn't let it. He'd learned to trust the printed directions he'd written himself on the back of Daisy's spelling test, which she'd left on the kitchen table that morning with a note that said, "Don't lose this, Dad," because she'd gotten 19 out of 20 and was proud of it. He found the property through a set of iron gates that opened before he'd fully stopped. The driveway was gravel, half a kilometer of it, lined with old spruce trees that made the approach feel like something formal being announced. Fletcher had worked on expensive cars before. He'd spent 11 years as a powertrain engineer at GM's facility in Oshawa before the layoffs, before the grief, before the garage in Stirling became the thing he could do from home while Daisy needed him close. He was not easily impressed by money, but there was a difference between money and this particular quality of old accumulated wealth that expressed itself in the stonework on the house, in the property extending toward the lake, in the 3-car garage attached to the east wing that was, on its own, larger than his entire shop back home. Nina Forsyth was standing on the terrace when the assistant let him out. She was in a charcoal blazer, hair pulled back, holding a coffee cup the way people hold coffee cups at meetings, present, functional, not indulgent. She was talking to 2 men in business attire, and she did not look up immediately when Fletcher approached. He waited, 15 seconds, 20. She glanced over. "You're the mechanic from Stirling." "Fletcher Dowd, you called my shop." She looked at him the way you look at a contractor when you're still deciding if you made the right choice. Not impolite. Assessing. "I've had the Ferrari specialist from the Toronto dealership here twice. I had an engineer who's published on vintage Italian drivetrains. Neither of them could tell me what was wrong." "Where's the car?" Something shifted across her expression, mild surprise that he hadn't responded with credentials or reassurances. "Around back, Thomas will take you." One of the men in blazers nodded and started walking. Fletcher followed. The garage was what it was, climate-controlled, lit like a showroom, 4 bays holding cars worth more than his house. In the far bay, under a fitted cover, was a shape that pulled his attention before Thomas had even reached for the cloth. The 1972 Ferrari 246 Dino sat the way rare cars sit, not like an object, but like something with a claim on the room. Low, pale yellow, the lines clean in the way of Italian design from that period, when the relationship between beauty and aerodynamics had not yet been resolved entirely in favor of efficiency. Fletcher walked around it without touching it. Thomas cleared his throat. "So the issue is—" "I'll look first," Fletcher said quietly. "Then you can tell me what the others said." Thomas nodded and left him alone. He crouched at the wheel arches. He checked the door gaps. He ran his fingers along the seam where the rear quarter panel met the firewall, feeling for irregularities the eye could miss. He looked at the chassis plate, then at the stamp on the body itself. He checked underneath with a flashlight, moving slowly, looking for exactly nothing, and therefore seeing everything. It was when he got to the rear section near the fuel tank mounting that something in him went quiet. The seam weld was wrong. Not wrong in the way of bad repair work. It wasn't sloppy. It was wrong the way a signature on a forged document is wrong. Technically convincing, almost correct, but carrying in its execution a specific quality that belonged to one person and one person only. Fletcher had seen that weld pattern once before. In a workshop on the east side of Montreal, in the winter of 2008, over 3 days when he'd helped strip a 1969 Alfa Romeo to its bare shell and watched Paul Therian demonstrate why you reinforced a chassis the way you did and not any other way. Paul had said, "The weld remembers who made it. If you know what you're looking for, you'll never confuse one man's work with another's." Fletcher stood up slowly and stared at the car for a long time. Paul Therian had died 2 years ago. A stroke in his apartment in St. Henri, alone on a Tuesday evening, found by his neighbor on Wednesday morning. Fletcher had taken Daisy to the funeral. She'd been 5. She'd held his hand through the entire service without saying a word, which was extraordinary for Daisy, and which told him she understood something was being marked even if she didn't know what. What was Paul Therian's weld doing inside Nina Forsyth's Ferrari? He said nothing when Thomas led him back to the terrace. He said nothing when Nina looked up from her phone, with the expression of someone braced for a disappointing answer. Her team had expanded. 4 people now, and one of them was a man Fletcher hadn't seen before, mid-40s. A certain careful ease, like someone who had practiced being relaxed in rooms where the stakes were high. "Well," Nina said. "I can fix it," Fletcher said. The man with the careful eyes raised an eyebrow. The dealership technician said the fuel delivery system needed complete replacement. "The fuel delivery system is fine," Fletcher said. "The car has a chassis repair that was done at some point, professionally, by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. The previous specialist didn't identify it because it doesn't look like damage. It looks like correct work." He paused. "It is correct work, technically, but it shouldn't be there at all." Nina studied him. "And you know who did it?" Fletcher considered the question carefully. "I know whose method it is," which isn't quite the same thing. That wasn't entirely true. He was already quite certain whose method it was. What he wasn't certain of yet was what it meant, and who in this room he should and shouldn't say it to. Nina tilted her head. Around her, the assembled people waited. And then she said, lightly, in the tone of someone making an offhand remark rather than a significant one, "Get that car running properly by Friday and I'll take you to dinner." Light laughter, quick and polished, the social reflex of people accustomed to each other's humor. Fletcher didn't laugh. He looked at the car. "I'll need 3 days," he said, "and I work alone." He was in his truck by 11. He sat in the driveway before turning the key, looked at Daisy's spelling test on the passenger seat, and turned it over. He wrote 2 words on the back, Paul Therian. Then he sat with the weight of that name and drove home. Daisy came out of school, with her backpack unbuttons and her hair elastic somewhere in the vicinity of her collar, and a paper turkey she'd made that she pressed against the truck window before Fletcher had fully stopped. Dad, it's for the fridge. It has our names on it." He leaned over to look. The turkey did have their names on it. His was spelled Fletcher, which he decided was close enough. "It's great," he said. She buckled herself with the automatic competence of someone who had been doing it herself for 2 years. "How was the car?" Interesting. "What kind?" "A Ferrari Italian, very old." Her eyes went wide. "Are Ferraris better than Mustangs?" "Different," he said, "not better." She considered this the way she considered most things, thoroughly, and with the specific gravity of someone whose conclusions were going to be aired regardless of audience. "I think Mustangs are better," she decided, "because Grandpa had one, and because they're from here. Ferraris are from Italy." "I know. That's my point." Fletcher said nothing to that because the logic was, in fact, pretty solid. That night, after Daisy was asleep, he opened his laptop and searched for Paul Therian. The results were the same as they always had been. The obituary in La Presse. A brief mention in a restoration trade newsletter. Paul Therian, master automotive restoration specialist, trained in Turin, worked across Quebec, and internationally for 4 decades. known for his exacting standards and his refusal to document his methods in any systematic way. His former apprentice Henri had been quoted, "He believed the work itself was the record. He thought if you needed the notes, you weren't paying close enough attention." Fletcher closed the laptop and looked out the window at the dark street. Paul Therian's weld pattern was inside Nina Forsyth's Ferrari. That wasn't coincidence. Paul had worked on that car, which meant he'd known something about it. And the question Fletcher needed to answer before he said another word to anyone in Kingston was whether that something was going to matter. He went back the next morning with his full documentation kit. He arrived at 7:30. He worked alone the way he always worked, methodically, photographing everything before touching anything. Paul's weld wasn't the only unusual thing. Once he knew what he was looking for, he found two others. Minor, easy to miss. The work of someone who'd repaired significant structural damage and done it so well that the car drove correctly and would continue to drive correctly for years. The repair hadn't compromised anything. It had saved the car. But it had been done without ever being disclosed. Fletcher photographed each repair and sent the images to his own encrypted email. Then he kept working. On the second afternoon, Nina appeared. Alone, no phone visible, which was its own kind of statement. "You came back," she said. "Said I would." She looked at the documentation on the workbench, the photographs, the notes, the record of what he'd found laid out with ordered precision. "The others left summaries," she said. "You document everything." "It's important to have a record," Fletcher said carefully, "especially with something that has value and history." She heard the weight under the words. He could tell from the way she went still. How much value? He thought about how to say it. "Miss Forsyth," he said, "before I answer that, the provenance documents for this car when you acquired it. Who handled that?" "Paxton did. Paxton Rawle, my CFO. He's been sourcing private assets for the company portfolio for 6 years. A pause. Why? Fletcher reached into his jacket and set a folded piece of paper on the workbench between them. He had photographed it before touching it, photographed the cavity in the firewall lining it had come from, photographed it again in his hands. He had read it twice in the garage before he'd been ready to move. It was written in French in the cramped, slightly backward slanting script. Fletcher had spent 18 months learning to read in a Montreal workshop. J'ai réparé ce que quelqu'un voulait effacer. La voiture n'est pas en faute. Regarde ce qui était là avant moi. PT. I repaired what someone wanted erased. The car is not at fault. Look at what was there before me. PT. Nina read it slowly, then again. PT, she said. Paul Therian, a restoration specialist from Quebec. He died 2 years ago. Fletcher paused. I trained under him for 18 months. I recognize his handwriting, his methods, and the specific weld pattern he used on this chassis. He repaired significant structural damage on this car. Damage consistent with what would typically result in a total loss insurance classification. Which means at some point, someone claimed this car was destroyed. He held her gaze, and then had Paul repair it. She looked at the note, then at the car. Something moved through her expression. Not panic, but the controlled vertigo of a person realizing the ground has been a different shape than they believed. Paxton found this car for me, spent 4 months locating it, told me it was a clean acquisition from a private collector in Quebec City. I know, Fletcher said quietly. She was very still. How long have you known? Since yesterday afternoon. I wanted to be certain before I said anything to anyone. The silence in the garage had weight. I need to make a call, Nina said. Her voice was steady. It cost her something. I know, Fletcher said. The attorney's name was Harriet Quinn. She kept an office on Princess Street in Kingston, and the kind of face that had not been surprised by human behavior in approximately 15 years. She wore reading glasses on a chain, communicated primarily in short, accurate sentences, and had never once met Paxton Rawle. Nina called her from the terrace. Harriet picked up on the second ring. I need to see you today, not on the phone. A pause. 4 o'clock. I'll move my 3:30. That was it. An hour later, Nina placed Paul Therian's note between them without speaking. Harriet read it without touching it first, then picked it up carefully and read it again. Where did this come from? Inside the car. The mechanic found it. Do you trust the mechanic? Nina thought about Fletcher Dowd, the way he'd set the note on the workbench without editorializing, the photographs taken before touching anything, the fact that he'd come back the next morning when he could have left. "I do," she said. He knew the man who wrote this. Harriet set the note down and removed her reading glasses. The car was acquired through Paxton Roll, so either he didn't know this note was here, or he knew and acquired the car anyway, which means he believed no one would ever find it. She put her glasses back on. "I want the original title transfer, any insurance history through Transport Canada, and the full provenance chain. Don't ask Roll for any of it. Go to the source directly." A pause. "And nothing changes in your behavior toward him until I tell you it can. Not a word. Not a shifted meeting." Nina looked at her steadily. "The mechanic, he may be in a position that's exposed. Is he the kind of man who understands discretion?" Nina thought of Fletcher Dowd sitting in a garage that smelled of oil and October cold, holding a folded piece of paper before deciding what to do with it, bringing it to her instead of anyone else. "Yes," she said, "he is." Fletcher found the second thing on the fourth day. In the original VIN stamp, beneath a layer of paint that was factory correct, in every visible respect he found a ghost. A second stamp, faint, detectable only with the right light and the right patience. A different number, a different identity. He photographed it from 6 angles and sat in the garage for a while afterward, thinking about Paul Therian, who had repaired a car that someone had tried to make disappear and had left a note inside it, because he believed someone would eventually come looking. Paul had always said, "Work done honestly doesn't disappear. It waits." Paxton Roll came to the garage in Stirling on a Tuesday morning. Daisy was at school. The shop was empty except for an old Camry that needed pads and was absolutely not going anywhere fast. Fletcher heard the car on the gravel out front. He knew the vehicle from the Forsyth estate. He set down the caliper he'd been holding and waited. Paxton came in with his hands visible and his posture calibrated to casual. He looked around the shop with the mild interest of someone taking inventory. "Nice place," he said. Fletcher said nothing. "I wanted to talk." Paxton shifted slightly, not toward him, just a change in the geometry of the room. "Man to man, off the record. You found something in a car and may have misinterpreted what you were looking at. The situation has context you're not aware of." "Paxton," Fletcher's voice came out flat. The man stopped. "I know what you're doing," Fletcher said. Paxton smiled, the careful kind. "You have a daughter," he said, 7 years old, I believe, goes to Stirling Public School." The room changed temperature. Fletcher stood very still and felt something settle in his chest. Not fear exactly, though there was some of that. Something older and harder. The particular stillness of a person who has finished deciding something. "Leave this garage," he said. "Right now. And don't come back. And don't say my daughter's name again." A long moment. The Camry ticked as the engine cooled. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck passed on the main street. Then Paxton Roll adjusted his collar, turned, and walked out. Fletcher stood in the empty garage and breathed. Then he picked up his phone and called Harriet Quinn. "He came to my shop," he said when she answered. "He mentioned my daughter, her age, her school." A short, precise silence. Did he threaten her directly? "He knew her age and her school. He wanted me to know he knew." "Stay there. Don't call anyone else. I'm calling the RCMP investigator on this file in the next 60 seconds. She hung up. Bernadette Cote from next door was at his door by 5:30 with a container of soup and an expression that said she already knew something had happened. She was 68, born in Hearst, moved to Stirling 40 years ago, when her husband took work at the mill, widowed a decade back, and possessed of a particular intuition about her neighbors that she described as just paying attention, which Fletcher had long suspected was an understatement. She put the soup on the stove. She sat down across from him. "The case you got pulled into," he said. "The person at the center of it came to the shop today. Said things he shouldn't have said." She looked at him. About Daisy. Adjacent to Daisy. Her face went through something and arrived at a controlled stillness. "Is she safe?" "I've spoken to the lawyer. The RCMP are moving on it. But I wanted you to know. If I ask you to pick her up somewhere specific, or if anything feels off to you at any point." Obviously. She said it the way she said most things, like the appropriate response had been evident from the beginning, and she was slightly tired of stating it. Then she leaned forward. You did the right thing getting involved. I know you weren't looking for it. I didn't have much choice. People always have a choice. She stood and went back to the stove. You just made the correct one. A pause. Now eat something. You look like you haven't since breakfast. He hadn't, actually. The RCMP laid the additional charges on a Friday. Harriet called at 7 in the morning while Fletcher was making Daisy's lunch. Witness intimidation. Obstruction. The insurance fraud itself. The Ferrari wasn't the only vehicle. There are 6 others. Paxton Roll filed total loss claims on all of them over 8 years, had them secretly repaired, and reintroduced them into circulation through shell companies. Your documentation of Paul Therian's repair work and the ghost VIN gave the investigators the pattern they needed to unravel the whole thing. A pause. Mr. Dowd, the note said, look at what was there before me. You looked very carefully. That matters. He drove Daisy to school and sat in the parking lot for a moment after she disappeared through the front doors. Backpack swinging, already in conversation with her friend Celia before she'd gone 5 steps. He thought about Paul Therian in a Montreal workshop in February, explaining why a weld was a kind of argument, why honest work persisted, why the machine eventually told the truth about how it had been built. He drove back to the garage and got to work. Nina called on a Wednesday afternoon in November. Her voice was different from the terrace voice, quieter, less managed. 6 years of Paxton in every major acquisition, every asset decision, she said. And I keep going back, trying to find the moment I should have seen it. Fletcher was leaning against his workbench. The afternoon was going gray outside the high windows. You built something real, he said. Whatever he was doing around it, you built real things. Those don't come from someone who wasn't paying attention. They come from someone who trusted the wrong person. That's not the same thing. Silence on the other end, long enough that he thought he'd lost the call. Thank you, she said finally. Simple, real. I mean it. I know you do. A pause. How's Daisy? He smiled despite himself. She wrote her hero essay about Paul Therian. What? She overheard me talking about him. She said he sounded like someone who did his best work even when nobody was watching. Her teacher gave her a B+. A laugh came through the phone, short, genuine, nothing managed about it. That's a very good kind of hero, she said. She thinks the grade was unfair. She's probably right. They talked for another 20 minutes. Easy conversation, the kind that doesn't need to go anywhere to justify itself. When they hung up, Fletcher stood in the quiet garage and noticed the particular quality of that call. No one had asked him to be anything except what he was. He went back to work. The plea came down in December. Paxton Roll pleaded guilty to 8 counts of insurance fraud, 2 counts of fraudulent asset transfer, and 1 count of witness intimidation. The sentencing was scheduled for February. Fletcher was making oatmeal when Harriet called. Your testimony about Paul Therian's methods was what the investigators needed to establish scope, she said. Without it, they had documents. With it, they had a pattern. That's a different thing entirely. A pause. Don't talk yourself out of what you did here. That would be a mistake. He stirred the oatmeal. Paul made it possible, he said. I just knew what I was looking at. That, Harriet said, with something close to warmth in her voice, is not a small thing. Daisy, once he told her a simplified version, sat at the kitchen table and processed it with the serious focus she brought to anything requiring a verdict. So the car had a secret, she said. Something like that. And Mr. Therian put it there so the right person would find it. He left evidence. He trusted that someone would come along eventually who knew what they were looking at. She chewed her toast. Did he know it would be you? No, Fletcher said. He just believed someone would come. She thought about this for a moment. That's a nice thing to believe, she said. He looked at her across the kitchen table. Yeah, he said, it is. Nina came to the garage in Stirling, for the first time on a Saturday in January, unannounced, with 2 coffees from the place on Front Street, which meant she'd done some research, because that was the only decent coffee in a 6-block radius, and he'd never mentioned it. She knocked on the open bay door. He was under a Jeep and didn't hear her immediately. When he slid out, She was standing in the entrance looking around the garage with the kind of attention that wasn't measuring anything, just reading the room. "You found it," he said. "You're in the phone book." She handed him a coffee and looked at Daisy's drawing on the wall, a garage with 2 stick figures and a car, framed badly in a dollar store frame because Daisy had asked him to hang it. "Is that hers?" "It's our garage, according to her." She smiled. Then she looked at him. "I spoke with someone at the Canadian Heritage Vehicle Conservancy in Oshawa last month. They run restoration residencies, 2 years, working on historically significant vehicles. Someone there knew of Paul Therian's work. When I mentioned your name and what you'd identified in the Ferrari, they asked if you'd be willing to speak with them." Fletcher set down the coffee. "You did that without asking me," he said. "I thought you might say no before you'd heard it." She met his eyes directly. "I know you have the garage. I know you have Daisy. I know it's not a small thing. I'm not suggesting you do anything. I'm suggesting you have a conversation." A pause. "The residency has family housing on site. There's a school 10 minutes away. I may have looked into it." He looked at her. "You may have." "I was thorough." He turned the coffee cup in his hands and looked at the garage, at the organized tools, at Daisy's drawing, at the life he'd built when the life before it had ended. He thought about what he'd said to himself, half aloud in this exact room, some months ago. You can't tread water indefinitely. At some point, you have to decide to swim. "One conversation," he said. She let out a breath, not dramatic, just the small release of someone who had been holding something carefully. "One conversation," she confirmed. He told Daisy on a Saturday morning with pancakes and rationed syrup, because the extraordinary news allowance did not extend to unlimited syrup, and she knew it. She listened with her serious face. "Would we live there?" she said. "There's housing for families, an apartment on the property. Would we come back after?" 2 years, then yes. She chewed, thinking. The particular focused interior expression of a child working something through that she wasn't ready to report on yet. "Then, is that why you like her? Because she figured out about the car?" He looked at his daughter. "I like her because she paid attention," he said, "and because she was honest about the parts that were hard." Daisy nodded slowly, filing this. "Okay," she said. "I think you should go." "Yeah? You always say the work teaches you things if you let it. Maybe this is that." She picked up her fork. "Also, Mrs. Cote told me last week she had a feeling about this." He stared at her. "Bernadette told you last week." "She said she just had a feeling." Daisy shrugged, unbothered. "She knows things, Dad." He got up and poured a second coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the January street. The hardware store, the library, the maple tree that dropped its keys in the gutter every autumn. He thought about a workshop in Montreal in the winter of 2008, and a man who had handed him a way of seeing that he'd carried every day since, without fully recognizing what it was. Work done honestly doesn't disappear, it waits. He went back to the table and sat across from his daughter. She was already eating again, with the efficient focus of someone who had made her decision and moved on to the next thing. "One conversation," he said, more to himself than to her. "That's how everything starts," Daisy said, without looking up. He didn't argue with that. Outside, the January morning was doing what January mornings do in eastern Ontario. Quiet, cold, unremarkable on the surface and full underneath. The day had already decided what it intended to be. All that was left was to begin it.